actor and active Trump supporter Jon Voight is mad about the Trump indictment, but he seems to not really understand it at all.
Must see this lie that they have brought upon President Trump. An indictment, this cruel intention, this lie.
Jon Voight is known for a few things, not least of which being that he is Angelina Jolie's estranged father, but he's an accomplished and award-winning actor, starting his film career in the late 60s. He's still actively making films, including the Ray Donovan movie last year, Fantastic Beasts and Where to Find Them, and he just made a Roe v. Wade truther film in 2020 with co-stars Roger Stone, Tomi Lahren, Stacey Dash, and Jamie Kennedy. So in this video, Jon Voight starts off by calling the Trump indictment a cruel intention and a lie, seemingly ignoring the fact that testimony was given and evidence was shown that led to the indictment. Testimony and evidence that Voight was not privy to. He also compares Trump's crime to Bill Clinton's, quote, true affair, which begs the question, does Jon Voight think that Donald Trump was convicted for the uncriminal action of having an affair?
We must not forget Clinton's true affair, and that they never caused this cruelty on any other president before.
As the rest of us know, Trump was indicted for committing campaign financing fraud, which is an actual crime. He goes on to say, quote, remember the walls of Jericho, the truth will prevail. Do you guys remember the story of Jericho, or do you know it? Have you ever heard it?
My fellow Americans, remember the walls of Jericho?
Truth shall prevail.
The 45th President of the United States shall save this nation from the barbaric left insanity, and we, the people, shall help with our truths and prayers. Let us all put faith back and remember the greatest president, Donald J. Trump, 2024. He and only he will build this land back to her beauty, where she will stand proud and she will hold the torch up for freedom, freedom of the people, freedom of our greatest achievement of red, white, and blue, the gift of what and who we are, the American dream.
Okay, before we get into this, let's talk about why we're talking about Jon Voight at all, because, like, who cares, right? But the reason is because whenever we get snippets like this from celebrities or social media mouthpieces, politicians, or whoever, we get some insight into what's being discussed in circles that we might not belong to, or even circles that we might actively avoid. It's important to understand where people are coming from, the beliefs that inspire their worldviews, even or especially if we don't agree with them. Understanding is not the same as agreeing. You can understand why Thanos thought he was supposed to destroy half of life in the entire universe, but that doesn't mean you agree with his reasoning, his beliefs, or his methods. So anyway, the story of Joshua and Jericho. In my liberal education years ago, I took a seminar back in college on the Bible as literature. And that as literature part was pretty crucial because it meant that we read the text as the words on the page, as we would read and analyze and seek to understand any other work of literature that didn't profess to be the word or will of a supreme being. The story of Jericho, when read in this context, taking out any notion of divinity or divine right, or of one side being obviously good while the other is obviously evil, well, it doesn't hold up. Of course, many Christians would argue that you can't take the divinity out of the Bible, therefore any point that I'm about to make is moot, but that's convenient for them because if you don't start from a godly assumption, the story falls apart quite quickly. They'll also be quick to remind you that this is an Old Testament story, but as it is being invoked today by a practicing Christian, we are talking about it. The underlying premise of the story itself is concerning, and the fact that a right-wing voice like Voight is invoking Jericho while communicating his support for Trump is a little scary. When Joshua was chosen as the leader of the Israelites, he set off to claim the land that God had allegedly promised them. This included the city of Jericho, a city that was heavily walled and fortified, so much so that the people of Jericho weren't even worried about invaders. Jericho was a city full of sin, but funny enough, the Bible doesn't tell you what was so sinful about it, or its people, apart from the fact that it was occupied by people who weren't the Israelites. The Israelites claimed to have a divine right to the land, so the people of Jericho living where they were living, regardless of how they were living, were doing so in violation of God's alleged will. Joshua brought his army to the walls, but upon seeing them so high and so strong, he wondered how he was ever going to conquer the city. No worries, God would help them. He gave them precise instructions, promising that if they followed them exactly, they would take the city. Any Israelite who disagreed or disobeyed with Joshua's divine plan, by the way, understood that they would be killed. Small detail. Anyway, all the Israelites had to do was march around the city for a week. 1 time around for 6 days, then 7 times around on the 7th day. At that point, the Israelites blew their horns, and the once mighty city walls of Jericho collapsed and crumbled just as God said they would. Joshua instructed his Israelites to plunder the city of its riches, not for themselves and certainly not for him, but for God, and everyone inside the city, except for a very select few, were killed. Oh, and then Joshua cursed the land. Anyway, the ruins of Jericho are still there today, and they're a popular tourist attraction in the West Bank, and I will leave that there. The symbolism of the story is obviously that with God's help, if you're acting within the will of God, He will help you conquer seemingly insurmountable odds. I imagine that's what Jon Voight was alluding to when he implored all of us to remember the walls of Jericho and how easily they crumbled. The story isn't even about spreading an ideology because they killed everyone in the city rather than attempt to convert them, again according to the will of God, but it feels a lot more like justifying destruction and genocide by claiming it's what God wants, by insinuating that the people of Jericho, for reasons the Bible did not provide, didn't deserve to live. But the fact that the Bible doesn't detail the reasons as to why the people needed to die is also kind of telling, and that too is relevant to the right-wing evangelical extremism we're witnessing across our country. For the believers, they only need to be told that the city's destruction was the will of God. That's it. They trust that God knows best. They believe that genocide needed to happen because far be it for them to question God. Of course, if they did question any of it, they'd be killed, but again, minor detail. It encourages belief without proof. It encourages conviction and even deadly, destructive action based on very weak justification. It discourages asking questions, and it discourages rational thought. Obviously, these walls didn't crumble because the Israelites marched peacefully around them for 7 days. Obviously, those walls crumbled by other means, so it's also ironic that Voight refers to the, quote, barbaric left insanity in the same video. Look, I'm all about allegory and metaphors in art and literature, and I'm all about invoking these things to foster deeper meaning and understanding of our modern world. But the allegory itself, the hidden meaning in the text that the reader is deriving, is largely dependent on the reader. When Jon Voight and I read the story of Jericho, we don't derive the same meaning. When I read it, I see blind justification for genocide and occupation. When he reads it, he sees a God that stood on the side of those who stood with him in his quest to eradicate the world of sin. The fact that this God chose to do this by inflicting death and destruction on the people of Jericho rather than extending compassion and empathy toward them seems to be not important or relevant to Jon Voight. It's not germane. It's not germane. All right, that's it for me. If you got anything out of this, please like and subscribe to the channel and be sure to follow me on Instagram and TikTok. Thank you.